Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 4. And actually, I'm going to apologize right in advance again. I have this cold that keeps hanging on. Actually, the cold part went away and I was doing fine. Then, for some reason, I kind of lost my voice again. So I'm going to sound like that, like a person losing his voice. So bear with me. This is a really short lecture, about 8 or 9 slides. And I have a couple of goals with this lecture, and let me get to those right away. So I gave you some assigned readings this week, and really what they have to do with is Social Security. I don't want to keep harping on Social Security as the only example of policy, but it is such an important example in our nation because really, literally, Social Security affects most other things um, in our national government. It is a very large part of our budget, as you know, and it's also going to affect a couple of generations, specifically the baby boomer generation, which happens to be my generation. You probably knew that. And most of you in your generations, the fact of the matter is that the ratio of workers to recipients of old age insurance, or the major part of Social Security, along with Medicare, um, which was added to Social Security in 1965, um, the the recipients are the recipient population is growing, the worker population is shrinking relatively. So the ratio of workers to recipients is shrinking. And by 2040, it's going to be much smaller than it was even this year, certainly far smaller than it was when Social Security was first passed in 1935. But so what I want to do this week is I want to do a couple things. One is I have given you some examples of policy analysis on Social Security. I gave you one really good report from the Congressional Budget Office. That's over 100 pages long. So look at the executive summary and then scan the rest of it. And that's a really good example of what I would call a nonpartisan analysis of Social Security. Because the Congressional Budget Office, as most of you know, is by its charter nonpartisan. And then I give you some examples of more partisan looks at Social Security. I have one from the Heritage Foundation, which self-identifies as a conservative organization. One from the Center for American Progress, which again self-identifies as a progressive or liberal organization. I have one from AARP, which often depicts itself as nonpartisan. You can decide whether you think AARP is nonpartisan or not. They are accused of being more liberal by some people, but they usually say that they only advocate for senior citizens. And then I give you a couple other reports. So the idea really is to look at the differences in those reports, all talking about the same subject matter, which is Social Security, and then trying to decipher the various perspectives that are used. And then my second purpose is to discuss an idea that I like to talk about, and this is the idea of using policy narratives, not only to create problem definitions, but also to understand how various people really frame policy problems per se. So policy narratives. There are a lot of ways to analyze policy. So I know you're all reading the texts. And there are ways to analyze policy that we would call a more rational approach. We regularly in the journals analyze policy using various quantitative techniques. The journals, if you didn't know, most of the journals really are swinging more towards quantitative analysis. than qualitative analysis. However, narrative analysis is actually a very important way, and more recently, more popular way to look at policy. Policy narratives are literally stories that people tell. So the view is that we 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 do tell stories, not just about policy, but stories are the things that connect us as human beings. Um, our mythologies that bind us together, um, and those stories are told in various ways about various subject matters. So Star Wars is a good guy, bad guy story, and it's a story of good overcoming evil, but that's an old story, right? It's not, it happened in a galaxy far, far away, right? But it's a very old story. So policy analysis really shouldn't be confused necessarily with a more interpretive approach to understanding policy, though there is some relationship. Um, so the interpretive approach really looks for the meaning behind the policy, often in the subtext that don't necessarily appear, um, but that we can suss out through looking at the visible language. So often we're talking about the meaning of a policy to clients or those affected by policies, and they interpret what they mean. There's a couple of really interesting sources that talk about interpretation. Devorah Yano has a lot of works that talk about that, but she has a book called "How Does a Policy Mean?" back in 1997, and then Ingram and Schneider, and I think a lot of you are familiar with this. They talk about social constructions of target population. So really, Ingram and Schneider interpret policy through the lens of how the client population is constructed on the part of policymakers. But back to policy narratives, what really policy narratives provide for us is a look at how advocates and opponents um, of particular policies attempt to frame or perhaps sell the policy to the public. And one of the early theorists, or one of the people that really kind of put it together in a sense, is Deborah Stone, um, who wrote a book called Policy Paradox back in 2002. And so this presentation relies mostly on her work. So here's what Deborah Stone had to say about policy narratives. And really, she relates it to storytelling. Why? Um, why is because, again, what we do as human beings is we tell stories. We tell stories to each other, right? About our civilization, about our culture, um, about our families, about the institutions that we are part of. And so, why shouldn't we tell stories about policy, right? Because it's relatable to other people. So, if I can tell you a story about policy, if I can tell, if I can get a chance to testify before Congress or before the state legislature, and I can tell you a story about how this policy affects me, you're going to respond to that. Now, should you respond to that? Well, I don't know, but you're going to respond to it because you're human. That is why we tell stories. Um, so Stone talks about stories as really just being what they are, a narrative with heroes, villains, and victims, right? That is how we tell our stories. That is how we tell our stories in books and movies, right? There are heroes, there are villains, there are victims. So think of the famous Kurosawa, The Seven Samurai, which was also became the Magnificent Seven, the Western, and even The Three Amigos was actually based on the movie. The Three Amigos was based on this idea of the Seven Samurai. There were clear heroes, villains, and victims in the Seven Samurai, right? There, the victims were the villagers, the villains were the brigands, and the heroes were the Seven Samurai. Unlikely people put together to rescue the village, right? And so Stone talks about the idea that sometimes a conflict, what seems to be a conflict over policy, is really a conflict over narrative elements. That is, that different groups of people talking about the same policy are really depicting um, certain people as heroes sometimes, but somebody else might depict them as villains, right? Um, and so by somebody's telling Congress might be a villain in a story, but by some person's telling Congress might be uh, the hero. Um, Again, we might talk about other policies, and some people might be victims, but they might also be depicted as villains. So Stone talks about a couple of different kinds of storylines, really more, but some two main ones, the stories of decline and the story of helplessness and control, really loss of control. And so there's a couple of variants of each of those. Let me talk about that uh, coming up here. So what's a story of decline? A story of decline is in the beginning things were good. So, but they got worse, right? So in fact, right now they're nearly intolerable and something must be done. Right? So what does this story do? Well, the story starts out with a recitation of how things have gotten worse, right? So example, crime rates have gone up. And then there's an implicit or explicit suggestion that in some time past things were better. I can remember the good old days when nobody committed any crimes. That's absurd. But we could say that, in the good old days, neighbors watched out for neighbors. We could leave our doors unlocked at night and never worry about crime in our neighborhood. Um, but sometimes the recitation might not be about humans at all, might be about things like the economy or budgets. I can remember when we thought it was a good thing to balance budgets, um, for example. And usually these stories, the story of decline features some prediction of gloom unless the change is made for the better, right? So unless we start to balance our budgets, we will be faced with a future where our children will do nothing but pay off national debt. Um, and do we want to do that to our children and grandchildren? And then there's always this drama of heroes, villains, and victims in the stories. There's these two variations of this story of decline. This change is only an illusion. Maybe you thought things were getting better, but they're really not. Um, for example, cancer rates really aren't improving. What's happening is only early detection is improving. Um, and so, but cancer is still killing people, right? And then there's stymied progress. We thought we were making progress, but then we were thwarted by some villain who stymied our progress. So you can think of just about any policy area. Let's just take a couple that are really in the news right now. So immigration. Well, the fact of the matter is Congress has argued with itself and consecutive administrations really about making uh, policy change to current immigration law, right? The last there was a immigration reform during the Reagan administration, but the immigration law that really still drives um, most of our immigration policy was the immigration law of 1965. Um, and then there was one during the late Reagan administration, but we really haven't had comprehensive immigration reform. But think about immigration and think about how um, various partisans depict immigration, right? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? And who are the victims, right? And you can listen to the news and you can hear those themes coming out: heroes, villains, and victims. And you know that different partisans uh, depict different sets of people as heroes, villains, and victims, right? You can think about several policy kinds of areas, and you can hear the stories as they are being told. So think about uh, climate change. Think about our continuing war in Afghanistan. You can think about a lot of different policy areas, and you can hear how the stories are told in terms of heroes, victims, and villains. So they vary by the story and the policy, but they're always present. So here's an example from some of my research. So what I have researched is U.S. military retirement policy. Um, so you didn't know this probably, but we started out this country with really sort of a view that um, we should have a very small military because the founders were really the founders were very heavily influenced by what had happened in Europe when um, monarchs would use armies to suppress their own population, right? So we really started out in the beginning with a mentality of a small military. Well, we soon figured out that we needed some kind of professional military. It wasn't ever very big until post World War II, but um, kind of an admission that we had a professional military was in 1862 when Congress actually came up with a retirement program that is uh, different than a pension, but a retirement program for a professional military force, which was very small. But that's been around since 1862. But the story of decline, if it's pictured that way, is post World War II. So post World War II retirement policy, basically the de facto program was that it allowed for a 20-year retirement with a defined benefit pension following um, all retired members for life. So um, the army and well the military up through World War II was actually the professional military was quite small, and but the professional military post World War II actually grew tremendously in size from what it had been in other post-war eras. Um, but so what happened was this grew more costly as years progressed because obviously there were just more retirees, um, and the basic military pay generally rose post World War II. So Congress attempted policy changes over years that would have raised the minimum years of service. And from 1948 to about 1983, there were somewhere around 19 or 20 different official studies that suggested some kind of change to the military's defined benefit pension, right? They were trying to change the years of service calculation or the percentage calculation. So during this time, in an increasing manner, because it was getting more expensive, some um, what I would call policy narrative coalitions arose. One were called the Reformers. They wanted changes to the retirement program in the interest of cost savings. And the other were what I called the traditionalists, or people who wanted no changes um, at all because it was an indispensable part of the personnel pay and benefits program. And so without that, it would be impossible to recruit and retain the military force that Congress required, especially during the all volunteer force era, which started in about 1972. And so, um, just a brief summary of who the reformers versus the traditionalists depicted as heroes, villains, and victims, and how they told the story of decline. So, for the reformers, the budget hawks in Congress and in the public were the heroes. The reformers relied on people in Congress, Democrats and Republicans, as a matter of fact, especially during the 70s and 80s, who said that um, really we've got to hold the line on the budget. We really have to strive for a balanced budget. And so this is just one more program that we have to find some money in. So they were the heroes of the story. The traditionalists said the heroes really were the military members, especially career enlisted members. They talked a lot about the willingness to serve the countries. These people were heroes. Okay, so who were the villains? To the reformers, in some cases, the military members themselves were the villains, but usually the way they told the story was that they talked about officers, specifically high-ranking officers like colonels and above, generals, who really were, in their words, milking the system, taking advantage of the taxpayer. Well, to the traditionalists, the villains were Congress, really. Um, and this comes out in the testimony that I have looked at and in the newspaper accounts that Congress basically wants to gut military retirement, and Congress is basically incompetent and clueless and are therefore the villains. Well, who are the victims? Well, the reformers, the victims are taxpayers. Okay, so this is some policy I studied, but taxpayers have often been depicted as the victims of government programs run amok. And you can think of specific examples of that, I'm sure. To the traditionalists, the victims were military families who really had done nothing but serve alongside their military members and done nothing but ask or do what their country asked them to do. And so here's how these opponents told this story of decline. The reformers said that, at one point in time, the United States had a balanced budget. However, government benefits like Social Security, military retirement, civil service retirement, and their generous cost of living provisions, which are based on the Consumer Price Index, make a balanced budget impossible. In fact, the famous author Aaron Wildavsky said that most of our budget problems in the 80s were due to CPI-based cost of living allowances in various government retirement programs. The traditionalists said that the story of decline was that, once there was a time in our country's history when Congress rewarded brave individuals who spent an arduous career in the service of their nation. However, Congress and now their smart civilian experts with no idea of sacrifice want to take benefits away. So what this is going to result in is that we will be unable to recruit an all-volunteer force. We will be unable to retain people, and this is going to force massive conscription, which nobody really wants. Nobody wants to go back to the draft days, and it's going to demoralize the military. So in both cases, we have this story being told that unless you do something, Congress, or don't do something, this, even worse things are going to happen. So Stone also points out some symbolic devices that people use in narratives. So we talked about stories, right? The stories of decline and the stories of control. There's this device called a synecdoche. That's how that's pronounced, which maybe some of you know. It's a small part of a policy problem used to represent the whole. The horror story, right? So you hear people talk about the Frankenstein monster. This has become a Frankenstein monster. Well, the book Frankenstein was really, it was about the monster, but there was a heck of a lot more to the story than that. But we use Frankenstein to depict, something that has gone horribly awry, right? The welfare queen was actually, it's a metaphor and a synecdoche, but basically that was a way of blaming the victim at one time, but it was also a way of depicting all of cash welfare by some who were opposed to it, right? A metaphor, which is obviously, I just used that, but it's a likeness used to basically get your attention, right? And to depict the entire problem. And then ambiguity is actually a very important device that holds stories together. It allows a lot of people to agree on things because they can read different words and meanings into things. So all that brings us to, and I'm under 25 minutes, so I'm really happy with myself, this week's discussion. What I want you to do this week is to look at those Social Security various policy analyses, and I'd like you to talk about what you see as the various narrative elements that come out of the partisan and nonpartisan accounts of Social Security, if you will. And does this variety of perspectives serve to broaden your own views on the subject or affirm some views that you already hold? So look at those in the spirit of actually learning about Social Security, but also look for the idea that stories and narratives are being told through those policy analyses. And then I look forward to your discussion. Thank you.